All right, I'm
And,
going mute.
and we share screen and we play from current slide. So I just want to review a little bit from where we stopped. It was a natural stopping place with the finally the Moscow strong enough to reject the Mongols' authority. You'll remember Moscow had been acting as tax collectors for the Mongols, so arguably collaborating. But after a few hundred years, they kicked them out. But what was the legacy of the Mongols? I just want to review that again because it's so important. That reality for Russian governments meant absolute, often brutal rule. And we've certainly seen that, especially with Stalin in our lifetime. And so the Golden Horde, who had been collecting tribute from Moscow, was retreated a bit. And we won't go over all that, but they still had a problem on their southern border. And it's the Turks. And I just want to review real quick the Turks and the role that they played. Arguably the first time they made their appearance in history was the Huns way back in the 4th century, and they came into Europe and they were part of the sacking of Rome, and perhaps they founded Hungary. And we know that Hungary is not an Indo-European language. It's probably a Turkic language. And last time we reviewed the Altaic languages, and we decided that language is a good first approximation of civilization, and it explains a lot. And you can see in blue that the Russians have a lot of Turkic civilization to contend with, even today. And we're going to be telling the story of Siberia. So I just want to point out across Siberia, there are Altaic speaking people, and they can be related to the Tunguiski, and obviously sprinkled all throughout our Mongol remnants of Mongols, if not the culture, then perhaps in the language. Just to remember that the Turks not only were a problem for on the southern border for Russia, but just remember they came sweeping in and gradually advanced over the centuries, conquering the Byzantine Empire and infiltrating to the gates of Vienna. And they arguably triggered the Crusades. When they took over the Holy Land, Western Christianity was no more dealing with Arabs. They had to deal with Turks, and that was a bridge too far. So eventually the Turks themselves were pushed out, the Tatars, and you've heard that name because there's a large Tatar population still living in the Crimea. And they, when Putin took over the Crimea, they expressed some hesitancy about that and spoke out against it, one of the few in Crimea. So the stands that we know about, the Kazakhstan all the way to Turkmenistan, they're all Turkic. And we talked last week about Erdogan's political game from Turkey itself, negotiating a corridor that would get them all the way to the Uyghurs that are having problems in China. And so if you see tension and you see China supporting Syria in the UN against Turkey, you begin to understand that, hey, there's still this great game going on. The other chapter in Turkic aggression was Tamerlane. He invaded Baghdad, poor Baghdad. They'd already been destroyed by the Mongols. And he goes into India, and arguably the Mughal name comes from Mongol, possible. But we know that Babar was a descendant of both Mongols and Turks. And this was Tamerlane's empire, centered at Samarkand. And my good friend Ramsey really wants to do this trip, and one of his main stops would be Samarkand. And so Babar, a descendant of Tamerlane and Genghis Khan, and arguably the last big invasion from the steppes. The steppes continued to cause Russia problems, and that's where we started our lectures, just talking about what was the incentive for Russia to finally take control of the steppes. And we went through this timeline, and of course they finally succeed. And this is a map of the layering of their additions over time as they finally bring the steppes under control completely by the reign of Alexander III, which ended in 1894. We'll be coming back to this map as we review, as we go back to the 1200s and the Ivan the Great and Ivan the Terrible, and tell the story about how this happened, at least with Siberia, the green and the brown. That's all we're going to focus on today. But it winds up with the Great Game, which is all about this intrigue between Russians, who are Indo-Europeans, and Turks and India and England, Anglo-Saxons. Just in England, worrying about India, their great colony, and the intrigue that goes on. A couple of great books have been written about that. I know Eichel's read them, and a lot of English adventurers wind up in the Great Game, and very interesting. So what does this all mean for Russian history? We started with Kiev, and they were rich. They had this great trade relationship. They mastered the river trade all the way from the Baltic down to Constantinople. Mongols finished them off and dominated for almost 300 years. Moscow collected taxes for them. But the Mongols allowed Orthodox Christianity to remain. But it certainly set up a psychology of governance in Russia. And the princes of Russia finally maintain a solid government. But what's the legacy of the Mongols? Well, there's the genetic. It turns out Lenin is 1/4 Mongol. I mentioned that last time. And he ushered in, Russia was an exceptional country in the 20th century, from the revolution to the Battle of Stalingrad to the Sputnik. Very exceptional. Everybody talks about America being the exceptional country, but certainly Russia was, and they did it without a huge industrial base. And the comment of American soldiers when they met Russian soldiers in Berlin was how interesting it was that many of them were Asian in appearance. And what gives the Russian leaders their audacity, their chutzpah, their boldness, maybe it's that history, that unique history that they have of having to fight Mongols and Turks and be aggressive. And so we know that they're only number 11 in world economy. And how
Now, wait,
much?
John, when you say only 11, you mean right now?
Yeah, right now they're only 11th. Juan Jose just joined us. Juan Jose, I talked a little bit about civilization in the first few minutes, but you can watch it on the YouTube.
I will, Professor. Thank you for
Okay,
everything.
welcome. And the question is, how did they make their money without a big industrial base? Well, now we know that it's the natural resources of Siberia, the natural gas and the oil. But what was it in 1386? I'm going to answer that question for you. The answer came through northern Russia. That's the answer. That was the path for Moscow. But remember, Moscow wasn't even on the map in 1200. The Mongols were about ready to take over Kiev. I want you to notice that right above the Kievan Empire is the Republic of Novgorod. So we're going to talk a little bit about Novgorod. So here's Novgorod. Novgorod is 300 miles north of Moscow. You just got to know that. And it was the first stop of the Vikings as they came down through the river waterway system. Now, there's no solid river that goes through Novgorod, but there's a lot of areas where you could portage with your flat bottom boats. So this was the first accessible place. And this is where the Vikings started and only later moved down to Kiev. The other thing I want you to know is how many lakes and how swampy this area is. So it wasn't very inviting. And so there's a reason Moscow settled down south. You can see, I pulled up this vision because I think the tan represents the swampy areas, and you can see how wet it is there. So medieval Novgorod, after Kiev falls to the Mongols, it becomes a republic. And it lasts for 300 years, a very prosperous republic. It ties into the economy of the Baltic and the trade with the Hanseatic League and all those northern German cities in the Baltic countries as well, in particularly Riga. Which is the capital of Latvia and is the most Germanic of the three Baltic countries. So the Estonia is more Scandinavian, and Lithuania is more Catholic. And so that's, you think of those three Baltic countries as being synonymous, but they're all have such a different civilization and the myths that they believe in and what they identify. Politically, they were very united in opposing a common enemy, namely Russia. So Novgorod. So no more Kiev, just Novgorod. Now we went to an exhibition and it was striking about the early days of Novgorod. And they said Novgorod traded with Regensburg. We'd been to Regensburg and we're going, huh? How the hell did they do that? Well, here you need to know a little bit more about the river system. So here we know very well about this. This is a different spelling of Kiev. And down to Constantinople. But as long as you're passing the mouth of the Danube, why not go up the Danube? And this is how they got to Regensburg and Budapest and Vienna and finally Nuremberg. So you could get ginger cookies in Novgorod from the ginger in Nuremberg. So the four largest rivers in Europe, it's time to talk about that. It's the Rhine, the Danube, and now we go to Russia, the Volga, and then finally the Neva. And so it's the Neva water system. I'm going to ignore that, and I'm going to ignore St. Petersburg for now, because it doesn't play much into the story. There's a problem with Russian society getting into the Baltic, and you're going to meet it in just a second. But the Neva water system is the fourth largest one of Europe after the Volga, the Rhine, and the Danube. And you can see this big water system here, and we're not surprised with the swamps and everything. And I'll just mention a link to World War II. Of course, this had been renamed Leningrad, St. Petersburg. The communists renamed it. They didn't want anything to do with Peter the Great. And the siege was going on for, I think, 400 days, 500 days. And what the citizens of Leningrad, who were starving, they looked out to the Lake Ladoga, and it was frozen over, and there were Russian troops with supplies on Lake Ladoga. And they had finally the opportunity to break through and relieve the siege. I just had to mention that as long as this was up on the map, because this happened in some of our lifetimes. The real development for Moscow and how they're going to break through eventually to the south is the Volga, which empties both into the Caspian, but also has a link to the Black Sea. And here's Volgograd, but during the communist reign, it was called something different. So here's the Volga drainage basin. During the communist time, Volgograd was called Stalingrad. And we've talked about that as being the bloodiest battle in human history. And in our lifetime, perhaps the most significant. I'll finish with St. Petersburg, and we'll tuck this all away until later. When we get to Peter the Great, a very interesting story when we get there. But the Neva drains the Great Volga-Baltic waterway. So what was the problem of expanding to the west? It was blocked by the Teutonic Knights. And we've talked about these guys. These fellows came back from the crusade, and they knew that there were still pagans up in the Baltic area. So they moved in, and their legacy is strongest in Latvia. As I said earlier, the three Baltic countries, Latvia is the most German, and it's very German, very German. from the economics to the culture, the civilization. Juan Jose, what do they believe? What are the myths they believe? What is the religion they have? And it's all very Germanic. And so the Teutonic Knights, they're pretty warlike. We've gone over that. And there's no way that Russia can even think about expanding to the West. And Russia at that time doesn't exist. It's Novgorod, the Republic of Novgorod. So Novgorod can't expand to the West. So they face in Kievan organization faced the Lithuania, the Poles, the Balts, the Prussians, and also the Western Slavs. This is called Kievan Russia, but later Kiev falls, and it's Novgorod that's carrying the weight. And the Western Slavs, I want to make the point, there's now a cleavage between Western Slavs and Eastern Slavs. And we'll talk more about how that happened. It happened as early as the 800s when the Holy Roman Empire, led by Otto, started spreading eastward. And they offered the holy part to the Poles. And when the Orthodox missionaries got to Poland, it was too late. They had already accepted Roman Catholicism. And we know what an important mythology that was for Polish nationalism. We know that the Pope at the time, John Paul, was a booster of Polish nationalism, and that's what was one of the huge factors in the spirit and how they eventually could get out from under communism. So the same was true for Hungary. Russia, the West, the East Slavs lost the West Slavs to Roman Catholicism, the religion, the very important part of civilization, the mythology and of the spirit. And this is, by the way, pictures of Cyril and Methodius, because when they failed in Poland and Hungary, they said, well, heck, let's go east and see what we can do with those Slavs. So they were from Constantinople, remember, and they bought Orthodox Christianity to Kiev. And we remember how Vladimir converted and had the mass baptism in the Dnieper River in Kiev. And this is all commemorated in this millennium monument in Novgorod that was constructed in 1864, when Russia was pretty
18 or 8?
Well, it was a millennium. So 100 years later, it's 18. So it's the millennium celebration, starting the clock with these Orthodox missionaries. Who knows when to start the clock on Russian civilization? The first Viking, Rurik, may have been legendary and may not have existed. So this is a guess. But by the 1860s, for sure, Russia had closed the steppes and felt like they were in a mood to celebrate. So they put up this huge monument, and a lot of my slides, you will have noted, they are historic figures from that monument. Cyril, of course, did more than just bring the Orthodox Christianity. He also bought a alphabet, a way of rendering Greek into the Slavic language. So he helped them create and become a literate population as well as a spiritual one. And so we have this great schism, and this is what Cyril learned when he went to Hungary and Poland. Wait a minute, there's this, seems to be this line here, and this is the separation between Roman Catholicism and Orthodox Catholicism from Constantinople and from Byzantium. This split becomes really solid in the schism of 1054. We've looked at this graphic any number of times. We see the blue line becomes the Eastern Orthodoxy. There's a lot of complication here that we're just not going to go in. We're looking at the broad strokes, looking, well, what is it that creates civilization and the main differences. So we're not going to go into all this now. But when we return to Europe and the Reformation, we'll get into this big time, but not today. So what is going on with Novgorod and the Teutonic Knights? It's a constant struggle, that tension on that border. Sure, they're trading, but there's a military tension. And finally, the people of Novgorod had had enough with the Teutonic Knights, and what emerges is Alexander. He's called Alexander Nevsky after the Neva River. I don't think that's his given name, but it's Alexander of the Neva. And he defeats the Teutonic Knights. This is just about the time that the Mongols arrive from the south. The Mongols never get as far north as Novgorod. Remember, we said Novgorod's 300 miles north of Moscow. Well, it's getting too cold for them, so they never quite make it. This great battle is commemorated in this postage stamp. You see the famous battle on ice with the Teutonic Knight horse cracking through the ice. Meanwhile, what about Kiev? It was taken over by the Mongols, remember, and destroyed. The whole early Rus civilization, the Kievan dynasty, is gone. And so as the Mongols retreat, guess who comes in and takes over Kiev? And Kiev, by the way, is the center of a political governance unit we call the Ukraine. And boy, has that been in the news in the last 4 years. So we know the Ukraine, and even before that, I think it was 2014 that Putin took over the Crimea Peninsula, and we've seen the Crimea Peninsula all the time, and we know Putin took it over because that's where Vladimir was baptized. We had a lot of slides on that. Well, what happens after the Mongols leave? Novgorod is in no position to go down and reclaim Kiev for a Russian society. But the Lithuanians and the Poles are saying, hey, we're here and we've established the largest landmass country in Europe, and that's the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. And so they come in and take over Kiev and the Ukraine, and it stays in the orbit of Europe and eventually Habsburgs until 1668. So that's over 300 years that the Ukraine is lost to the Russian civilization. So there's this tension in the Ukraine with its history. You got a 300-year gap. And you've also got Moscow, which is a newcomer, doesn't even exist in 1320, or just beginning to exist, looking longingly at the history of Vladimir and Kiev. And now it's in the hands of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. So it has ramifications for today's politics. Again, I asked the question, how does Russia make money in 1350? They can't expand to the south. They can't expand to the west. The only place they can expand is the north and the east. And the way they make it, their bridge economy is furs. Furs. This is the bridge to oil and gas, which finally comes in the 19th century. But at first, it's furs. And it foreshadows the American Pacific Northwest history. And I hope I'm going to get to that, although I'm beginning to doubt it. This is such a rich history. Siberia was already inhabited. It wasn't empty. There have been Mongolians and Turks, Altaic speakers there for time immemorial. And this is Dersu, famous Kurosawa movie. If you haven't seen it, take a look. And just to remind you, we're going back to the Altaic language map again. This is not Indo-European, right? What's the in the margins here is Indo-European, but the blue blotches are the dominant language in all of these areas. They're either Turkic or Mongol or whatever Tungusic is. Important to keep in mind, these lands are not empty. There are people there that have a civilization. And parts of this civilization have become Muslim. The Muslims' religion has penetrated up and up and up, and there are these warlords called khans. A khanate is just another name for warlord. We're learning there's a lot of names for warlords, but they have adopted Islam. So every once in a while, Islam intrudes and clashes with the Orthodox religion. So finally, we have Ivan III rejecting the Mongol authority. And here's Ivan III on that millennial commemoration in Novgorod, a historic city. The UNESCO has named it one of its historic sites. Finally, you get Ivan the Great's son, Ivan the Terrible. And it's Ivan the Terrible who expands into Siberia. He gets the credit. But let's take a look at Moscow at beginning of Ivan.
Before you go in there, can I ask a question?
Sure.
I'm still really befuddled to think that the Russians were the ones that stopped the people of the steppes. After all, you know, Russia, they didn't have Kiev, they didn't have Moscow, and here was the Mongols pushing up. How could they have defeated it? They weren't very strong, I don't think. It doesn't seem like it.
Well,
how did they beat the people of the steppes?
I'm just about ready to tell you the story.
Oh, okay.
This is thank you for emphasizing the path that we're on. So here's Moscow. Look at Novgorod. Novgorod, okay, we can't go into the Baltic, but by God, we can get very close and we can control the north. We're used to living 300 miles north of Moscow, and we could go into these wetlands. And there's a lot of resources in these wetlands. One thing that they lacked was salt. And so they went in here and that was their initial economic activity. Interesting, when we visited Poland, we went into the salt mines near Auschwitz, a very sad visit, but the diversion was to go to these amazing salt mines. And we learned there that when they were mining salt, in Krakow, the weight of salt was worth the weight in gold. So rare was salt. And the word salary comes from salt. So it's associated with money. But Novgorod found some salt up here, and that was their first economic toehold. So Moscow is just this little blue thing at the time of Ivan the Great, and they start looking around and say, you know, we're pretty strong now. We've been strengthened by fighting off the Mongols, and they started looking at Novgorod. And they eventually attack it and take it. So Ivan the Terrible takes all this yellow. Now they've got a foothold in the north. The next impediment is Kazan. I think it's Islam at that point. And when Aiko and I visited Russia, we kept seeing all the Madonnas of Kazan. The battle with Kazan was a great battle that's remembered in the religion, with the Madonnas named after Kazan. And it's Ivan the Terrible's conquest of Kazan. That's a huge step in Moscow taking a step forward. And this gives them a way down to the, at least to the Caspian Sea. It's disputed, but there's that possibility. And they take all this, Ivan takes all this territory. So they're often and running. They've expanded, they've multiplied their size times 5 with military conquest, and that gives them economic resources. And the fur trade is going to be extremely important, as it was in the Pacific Northwest. So,
oh, John,
yeah.
I suppose you will talk about why Ivan the Great was called that and why Ivan the Terrible was called that.
Thank you for that lead-in question. We call him Ivan the Terrible, but there's an alternative translation, Ivan the Mighty. Ivan the Great was called great because he expanded that territory, and he had enough nerve to kick out the Mongols. So what was the mechanism of controlling Siberia? So I want to introduce you to the Stroganov family. Very important family. They were a family that first made their money in Novgorod salt. And they decided, we've done so well in the north, we're going to be the Siberian explorers. Now, when Moscow took over Novgorod, they made friends with the Stroganovs. Hey, we need each other. So how about let's do a deal? I'm going to give you hegemony over Siberia for 20 years. You go in there, you don't have to follow any Russian laws. You're on your own, and go and conquer that land. And they were very aggressive. They went in there. There's one probably apocryphal story about, as intruders into the land of one of these Khans, a Stroganoff was captured and flayed into beef. Let's hope that's not true. But let's hope this is true, that a French chef created beef stroganoff for the family. So the Stroganoffs grow and prosper, build manors in areas of Siberia where that's possible, start building churches. Is a great tradition among oligarchs to build churches. We saw it when we traveled in Russia. All the new oligarchs that are in league with Putin show their appreciation by building churches. I can't tell you how many churches we went into. The sign said built by, and we say, who's that? And I said, oh, it's the local oligarch. So they continue on for centuries, the Stroganoff family. And they have a beautiful little house in St. Petersburg. But they don't do the heavy lifting. They employ Yermak. Yermak is a name to remember. He is the Russian Daniel Boone. He doesn't go west, young man, go west. He goes east. And he's the fearsome explorer. Think of Cortez, think of Pizarro, just audacious guy. I think this portrait captures that.
And don't forget his brother Tarmac. The road to civilization.
Okay. So he puts together a motley crew of Cossacks, but they can't get on their horses. The land, as I said earlier, it's too wet for horses, and where it's not wet, it's wooded. The only way you can get through that area is a combination of walking and flat bottom boats like the Vikings did. And off they go to trap and get pelts and valuable furs. And what's the value of an animal that's from the far north? The value of an animal from the far north is that evolution has pushed them to create really, really thick fur. And it was highly prized. Why? Because Europe was going through the Little Ice Age. So you see all these, and we will see all these Renaissance paintings of Dutch burghers, and they'll have fur on. And the Russians did quite well with the fur trade. Pelts was a great commodity. I saw an interesting biography of Genghis Khan, and one of his shrewdest political moves was to give his favorite fur to an older warlord. It was just an illustration about how valuable fur is. Fur for us now is something that we hear about in the context of animal rights. But during the Little Ice Age at this time, a fur was very valuable. And so Yermak bought back all these furs and laid them at Ivan the Mighty, laid them at his feet. Ivan the Mighty, Ivan the Terrible, gave him a gift of heavy armor. So you go back out there and you tame those Khans. So he put on his heavy armor, and in a battle on the water, he drowned because he couldn't float. Yermak, he made it into the millennium statues in Novgorod. He's there, as I said earlier, Daniel Boone. And you see statues of him around. I want to, I'm looking at the time here. I'm mindful of the time. I want to extend just a little bit beyond Ivan's great achievement. 60 years after he dies, all of Siberia, this is the kind of brownish part, is added to the kind of greenish part. But I just want to take a peek at the next phase, which is the red phase. And I'm just going to kind of escape the boundaries of time, just to extend the story out a little bit. And what I wanted, the theme of extending it out is, if you've got all this cold land, you also want warm land to grow food. You can't grow food here. So you trade the furs for food, but it's better if you have a source of food within your own boundaries. So I want to go back to the return of the Ukraine in 1686. Remember, they had defected to Poland-Lithuania in 1686. They double defect. They return to this Moscow thing. It looks like Moscow's got something going here, and they are talking about Russian civilization. And they're including Kiev in that mythology. So let's return. Our language is similar to theirs, and we've got all this overlap with history. So they defect from Poland, Lithuania. Now, some of them remain Roman Catholic, and that's a tension to this day. So here's the Black Sea. This is kind of tilted a little on its side. And the red area is the part of the Ukraine that rejoins in 1686. And this is going to have implications right down to 2014, when Putin reinvades and takes the Crimea. So let's look at breadbasket, the concept of breadbaskets. If you've got all this cold, wet land you can't grow anything on, or this, you're going to get the steppes, which, yeah, they have grassland, but it's very thin soil, and you can't really grow crops. The best thing you can hope for is to be nomads with domesticated animals. And then we remember we talked a lot about horses and how horses allowed the Mongols to thrive. But getting back to a civilization, you're here in Moscow and you're interested in growing food. And so welcome back, Ukraine. You're one of the breadbaskets. You're far enough south, and the Ukraine was known as the breadbasket of the Soviet Union. And famously, Stalin tried to collectivize the Ukraine in the 1930s as part of his overhaul of Russian society. And the kulaks rebelled. They said, we don't want to be collectivized. We're individual farmers, always have been. And so they rebelled, and Stalin crushed them. And there was the Great Famine in the 1930s, where I don't know how many million died. I can't keep track of all these tragic numbers, but quite a few people died in the Great Famine
10 million.
In the 1930s. I'm sorry?
10 million.
Really? Wow. Okay.
Yeah, when I did the Soviet Union history, that's the number I remember.
Wow. So there you go. So at anyway, in 1686, welcome back, Ukraine. The other thing is the Volga area down here is another breadbasket, but there was no tradition. That had been a part of the Golden Horde, and there was no tradition of farming. So what do if you've got farmland that needs farming? You call for the Germans. So the relationship between the Slavs and the Germans is very complicated. And you'll know that Ivan, both the Ivans called for German craftsmen to come east to Moscow and build the churches. The Russian word for German is Nemetsky. And what that literally translated into is dumb. In other words, they didn't speak Russian. So when they arrived in the 1400s to build the churches, the Russians thought they were stupid because they couldn't speak Russian. So Nemetsky means unable to speak, dumb, that kind of dumb. So they settled in the Ukraine, the Germans did, and they settled in the Volga breadbasket. What? The Volga breadbasket. So the word went out, Germans, please come to the Volga area. There's great land here that's never been farmed. You won't have to pay taxes. You'll be exempt from the draft. And if you want to make beer, we won't tax that either. So that was a triple advantage. And all of a sudden, you got Germans coming all the way to the Volga. What the heck? All the way to the Volga. This looks like our Oregon Trail wagon teams. And here's a German with his long stem pipe. Germans in Russia. Here's a recruitment poster posted in Germany, come to the Volga. So many people did, and they prospered and they multiplied. Now, who invited the Germans? And this is where I'm going to have to end, but here's my punchline. Was it Peter III who invited the Volga Germans? No, it was his wife. Who was his wife? A German princess. And after she became queen, she had her husband assassinated. And there's a lot more to talk about, and we'll come back to Catherine the Great big time when we return to Russia in the age of the European Enlightenment. But here she is in her glory. And who was responsible for getting her fixed up with Peter III? Frederick the Great, the matchmaker. And boy, when we get to Germany and Frederick the Great, it's quite a story. I'll just give you the brief version. He was gay. He had an affair with Voltaire. He was a rabid conqueror. He expanded Prussia manyfold. He increased Prussia's influence. He started the 7 Years' War, or what we call the French and Indian War. And he's the answer to the question, why is there a city in Pennsylvania named King of Prussia? Why are there a lot of pubs in England called King of Prussia? And the answer is Frederick the Great went into an alliance with Britain. And that was part of the 7 Years' War and allowed England to defeat France and get the Ohio Valley from the French. And I guess that's where I'm going to have to leave. When we return, I want to just do a brief thing on the three monarchs that divided Poland. It was the two we were just discussing, Frederick the Great, Catherine the Great, and Joseph of Austro-Hungary. So that's where we'll start next time, and I'll take some questions for those of you who can stay.
So interesting.
It's fascinating. It's absolutely riveting. I've particularly enjoyed this chapter.
And very well done.
Thank you.
I feel every week like I'm coming back to a bedtime story. You know, like, oh, now what's going to happen?
Well, I'll just give you a preview for next week. I've hinted that the Pacific Northwest also was important for the fur trade. And it's going to end in a story in San Francisco where Rob lives, and Rob knows this story well. And that's, Rob, that's going to be our punchline. Oh, I forgot to say, I put in the email, I'm not going to be able to lecture next week, so it'll be in 2 weeks. And I think some of you were concerned. No, it's I have an opportunity to be Sherpa'd on a long backpack overnight, 1-day backpacking trip. And I'll be able to report on that in 2 weeks, but it's a good thing. It's a chance for adventure that ICO is allowing me to take.
Where are you going, John? Where is it?
Okay, I'll tip you. I'm walking down Mount Diablo with two doctors, a father and son. The father's 20 years younger than me, and so the son is just doing his residency. We're very close. He got me back into backpacking, and they're going to Sherpa me down. I've walked up twice, and I might try to walk up again, but I thought I'd see if I can walk down first.
Walking down is difficult.
Yeah, I know. We'll see.
This is the Peppers.
Yeah, that's Pepper. It'll be a test of my knees, but walking up is a test of my heart. So first I'll test the knees, and then we'll see.
This is Johnny's request for his 80th birthday.
My God, John, you're taking hiking poles, I'm sure.
Oh yeah.
Oh yeah.
Good.
Oh yeah.
And,
Oh,
and
yeah. And the youngest doctor, my youngest Sherpa, has said that he'd carry my backpack if absolutely necessary.
Yay.
So wish me luck, and I'll see you all in 2 weeks.
Good luck. Thanks, John. Great.
Thank you, John.
All righty. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Have a good time.
Thank you.